So today, I got a spicy one for y'all. We're diving into the Cod Wars. And I mean cod as in the fish. Sorry gamers. We're going to talk about fierce rivalry between Iceland and the UK, lasting for almost 20 years from 1958 until 1976. 3 different confrontations in total, and even though these aren't considered wars technically, they still provided plenty of absurd scenes. Because yeah, we're talking about the UK, a former superpower with a population above 50 million, and Iceland, a former Danish colony with a population underneath 200,000. It is like Manchester taking up Knagsperu Verlag Reykjavik. But then, spoiler alert, Manchester lost 3 times. So let's start at the beginning. Both Iceland and the UK had deep economic and historic ties to the fishing of cod. Simply put, the Brits love cod. And even more so than today, back in the 50s and the 60s, fish and chips was a really common meal. Loads and loads of fish and chips. And this cod fishing industry was centered around port towns such as Grimsby, Hull and Fleetwood. So it is the 1950s and all the cod around Iceland was getting gobbled up. So to protect their livelihood, the Icelanders just had to do something about the British. Achieving independence from Denmark after World War II, the existing treaty the UK had to fish in Iceland's waters was nullified. This gave Iceland the chance to extend their maritime boundaries, while they would later actually iron that all out through international law, retroactively. They moved it from the usual 3 miles to the new 4 nautical miles. Doesn't seem that much, but this excluded fishing ships from the UK, or trawlers as I shall call them from here on, from lots of stocked fishing grounds. The British felt a historic connection to these fishing grounds, where they had come for many generations. Therefore, in response to the 4-mile extension, the Grimsby Evening Telegraph called it Black Thursday, and to show how sad they were, the flags there flew half-mast. The British fishermen, however, couldn't help themselves to pull a sneaky one, and off went their trawlers crossing the 4-mile line anyway. They would drop their nets, and in response, the Icelandic Coast Guard would show up. However, the British captains would already have considered the fine in their finances, and they were very dry about it. Like, just imagine any British person you've ever met. The UK government, however, responded less dry, or maybe equally dry, depending how you look at it, by barring Icelandic ships to offload their catch in UK ports, which was Iceland's main customer. However, in response, they just went to sell more fish to both the Soviet Union and the United States instead. And for a time, the situation remained as such. Then, a few years later, in 1958, things got hotter. During the world's first conference of the law on the sea, Iceland felt cute, and they extended their maritime boundaries from the 4 nautical miles to 12 nautical miles. The Brits didn't like that. Again, they were messing with the fish and chips, and that food is just too important for them. So this time around, the Royal Navy also got involved to protect the trawlers. They deployed 37 gunboats, while Iceland only possessed 6. The British Navy would threaten to open fire and sink the interfering Coast Guard. But they weren't actually allowed to do so. Iceland could do equally little, so instead they resorted to just registering all the British ships they would spot within the 12-mile zone. That would teach them. What would mostly happen, the British fishermen would be spotted within the 12-mile zone. The Coast Guard would come and try to board the trawler, and in response, the fishermen would try to stop them by throwing coal, using nets, or by attempting to puncture their inflatable boats by throwing spears. Sounds like everyone had a great time, honestly. If the Coast Guard was finally able to board, the Royal Navy would arrive also, and in their turn detain the Coast Guard. On one occasion, the British simply wouldn't let the Icelandic Coast Guard off their ship. They got treated as guests, allowing them to roam freely around the ship and to mingle with the crew, with the exception to the excess of rum. Don't get these Vikings drunk. This account of one of the Icelandic captives also tells about a Navy sailor of Irish origin on the HMS Eastbourne declaring his allegiance towards the Icelanders and proposing to take over the ship. After remaining mandatory guests for 11 days, the Icelanders were dropped off in a rowboat off the coast of Keflavik. This caused some commotion because Keflavik housed an important NATO base, as Iceland is located in between the United States and the Soviet Union, and holds a central position in something called the GI-UK gap. Especially the US High Command present was quite surprised that the British warship was right outside their base, letting go of the Icelandic Coast Guard without their knowledge. That wasn't really good shield of the Brits. So, following this, NATO stepped up to broker peace. The Brits agreed to phase out their fishing within the 12-mile zone, and in return, the Icelanders gave in to the request of the UK to destroy the records they had collected on the British Navy activity. The treaty also contained a clause saying Iceland would have the right to extend their maritime boundaries even further in the future, but would have to give the UK an advance notice. And more importantly, in the future, they would have to solve their issues with the International Court of Justice. After 3 years of fighting, it was a clear victory for Iceland, and everything was cool again. Then, jumping ahead around a decade later, in 1972, Iceland again was very concerned about their fishing stocks. The herring was almost entirely gone, and there were fears that the same fate was awaiting their cod. Their fish dependency made their struggle an existential one. So after electing a leftist government with an attitude which argued that any deals made by the administrations before them didn't apply to them, they were like, let's go again. This time they extended their maritime boundaries to 50 nautical miles. The United Kingdom immediately took the matter to the International Court of Justice, and the court ruled in favor of Britain. Yet Iceland was like, I don't care, no big deal, whatever. The UK was having none of that. An important factor for them was that they had just joined the European Economic Community, which forced them into shared ownership over their own domestic fishing grounds with other European nations. At the time, this was not a problem because they still had plenty of access to Icelandic fishing grounds. So this time on, with the threat of losing those, the stakes got raised for the British. Just like last time, the trawlers set sail for Iceland anyway. This time on, not yet assisted by the Royal Navy. They covered the names of their trawlers and replaced the Union Jack with the Jolly Roger. These disguises did not cause much confusion with the Icelandic Coast Guard. They were familiar with the different trawlers and could easily recognize the ships. Attempts at radio communication were answered by blasting Rule Britannia over the radio. The fishermen didn't care, as they assumed that getting boarded was the worst that could happen. And it was then that Iceland revealed its secret weapon. Developed at the end of the previous confrontation, but not yet used, it was a special net cutter, based upon the workings of a naval minesweeper. Immediately they went to work, cutting nets and chasing the trawlers out of their waters. One day alone, 18 trawlers were put out of action when their nets got cut. The fishermen were furious, pointing out how dangerous it was. The size of these nets is huge, with so much tension on the cables that, if cut, they would spring back like a snapped guitar string. On different occasions, the Icelandic Coast Guard would also fire at the trawlers, but crazily enough, both parties were just chill about it, keeping radio communication. Warning shots using blanks would eventually turn into warning shots with live ammunition, and if that wouldn't have an effect, the Icelandic Coast Guard would aim at the ship itself. They would announce their shots, aimed at the engine and urging those parts of the ships to be evacuated. After receiving confirmation no one was in the engine room, they would fire their shot and afterwards wait for the Brits to inspect the damage and report back, after which, if necessary, the Icelanders would place some more shots. The fishermen, angry with the lack of protection from their government, having later on only received 2 tugboats to help them out, went on to threaten to strike and to just relinquish the waters to the Icelanders if the Royal Navy would not get involved. The British government gave in, and not much later, Operation Dewey was launched. The British Navy vessels showed up, accompanied by patrol aircraft. This made the Icelanders furious, trashing the British embassy and even demanding from the United States to bomb the British ships. Obviously, the Americans did not oblige, and so the Icelandic Coast Guard just went with random Navy vessels, to which the British Navy didn't really have an answer. This went on for some time. The cat-and-mouse game involved the interesting ruse used by the Coast Guard. When the Icelandic vessels were spotted, either by British Navy vessels or the patrol aircraft, their coordinates would be broadcasted over radio. The Coast Guard went on to record these spotting messages and then, on a later date, rebroadcast them, causing confusion among the British. When the British understood what was happening, they would then broadcast a message to disregard the last message as an Icelandic ruse. That message would then in turn also be recorded, and after the British were broadcasting the actual coordinates of the Icelandic Coast Guard, the Icelanders would play the recording saying to ignore the last message. A beautiful ruse, if you ask me. The volatile situation would eventually lead to the death of an Icelandic engineer when, due to an evasive move, a wave caused him to be electrocuted during his welding repairs. This death led to the brokering of a ceasefire, burying the larger British trawlers from the 50-mile zone. So, for a second time, Iceland managed to push the British out of their fishing waters. But true peace still hadn't been achieved, as it was merely a ceasefire. Then, in late 1975, Iceland said, "I didn't hear no bell." This time, they weren't messing around. They extended their fishing zone all the way up to 200 nautical miles. Britain was also ready, and so they went again, even harder than last time. Nets got cut, ships got rammed, and live rounds were fired by the Icelandic Coast Guard. The UN Security Council was even consulted, but they refused to intervene. The ships sustained so much damage, vessels needing repair, that the British naval capabilities in the Atlantic were severely diminished for a year. Eventually, Iceland again started to threaten with the closure of their NATO base in Keflavik and to withdraw as a NATO member entirely if they wouldn't get their way, and suggestively might even get cozy with the Soviet Union instead. So these were serious threats that led to a brokered peace. The United States through NATO basically telling the UK to settle down, and Iceland again defeating this former superpower. There was the compromise of Britain being allowed to catch 30,000 tons of cod on a yearly basis. But this didn't stop fishing towns like Grimsby, Hull and Fleetwood falling into the impoverished position they remain in today. British long-distance fishing became history. So there you have it. My first video. Took me a while to make, but I'm happy to have finally uploaded something. If you know any other spectacular historical event or a different subject you would like me to discuss, leave a message in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Much love.